Joining us now, though, is Linda Moore, President and CEO of TechNet. Linda, welcome to the Business Briefing.
Thanks for having me, Janet.
Linda, to kick it off, can you tell us a little bit about TechNet and what your organization does?
Yes, TechNet was founded in 1997 by U.S. technology CEOs and senior executives and the venture capital firms that support them. It was always meant to be, and still is today, a bipartisan organization that educates policymakers on the challenges and opportunities facing the tech industry and also the overall economy. We advocate for a targeted policy agenda in Washington and across the 50 states on lots of issues affecting the economy and society, like data privacy, our workforce, or, as we might discuss today, AI. We're advancing the policy discussions at every level.
So, I find that really fascinating because the pace of advancement in technology over the past 20, 30 years or so has been such that technology giants have become the stewards not only of the finances surrounding their companies, but also the public policy, the ethics, and so forth. You've now recently announced a $25 million campaign entitled AI for America, and AI, of course, a hot-button topic for many reasons. What does your effort look like, and what do you hope the public will gain from it?
Yes, we're excited about our AI for America initiative. The goal of it is to demystify and familiarize the public and the policymakers with AI and how it is being used every day to improve lives, grow the economy, and keep us safe. AI has been with us for a long time. We've been using it to help navigate traffic, search the internet, undertake research, conduct a spell check, vacuum our home, discover new music, but it's also being used in ways that really impact society by predicting severe weather so that we can get out of harm's way. It's protecting critical infrastructure, defending against cyber threats, and accelerating the development of new medical treatments. Just today, we saw a study out that shows that AI is detecting 20% more breast cancer. So we want to make sure that the public and policymakers have a good understanding of what AI is, that it's been with us for a long time, and how well we're using it today. And also to work with policymakers to put in place really sound, thoughtful regulations that will protect consumers and the economy against any kind of risks that might be associated with AI.
You recently hosted an AI for Good event on Capitol Hill with lawmakers, industry experts. What were your takeaways from that event?
Yeah, it was really helpful to show a lot of policymakers on Capitol Hill the very thing I was just talking about. We hosted over 15 executives from our member companies with all different kinds of business models, ranging from NASDAQ, stock exchange, to Zillow that connects you with the home that you want, to Lyft that helps you get to where you want to go, plus a lot of others. And they talked about how they're using AI every day and have been for a long time to deliver to consumers the kind of services that they want. There was also talk about the importance of the care that they take with the data that trains their AI models to make sure that it is devoid of bias, and also that the AI systems are used to detect fraud and abuse. And so there are all kinds of applications that are being used across our economy. We'll host future events that will focus more on some of the ideas that I mentioned before, how it's used by agriculture to produce more abundant and disease-free crops, and also by the medical community to produce these new vaccines and new earlier signs of detection of disease.
Fraud and abuse is a concern, of course, not only for AI, but a number of technologies and technological applications. Now, TechNet has done a lot of work advocating for a federal privacy law, and I understand, especially with the advent of AI, that's increasingly important. Talk to us about how you expect to get this done with Congress.
Yes, this has been a difficult issue to try to get done. We've been advocating this for years now. And as I mentioned, TechNet does 50-state policy advocacy, too. And so we've seen this growing privacy regulation patchwork growing across the country. It started in California in 2018. In California, even, they still continue to revise and tweak their privacy law. So it's very hard for consumers and businesses to keep up with what is the privacy regime that affects them in their state. And now, in this past year, we're up to 13 different, often conflicting privacy laws in 13 states across the country, and it's confusing consumers as they travel from state to state and what is in my control, what is not, what are the rules affecting me now, but also businesses, especially small businesses, they cannot keep up with all the ever-changing policies in their own state, much less all the others. Very large companies can put together the resources to track these kinds of changes in the growing landscape because they have the resources to do it. But as we've seen in Europe and also in other places around the world, with a growing privacy patchwork, you'll have smaller companies that will just opt out and close up shop and stop operating because they don't have the resources to devote to this kind of compliance and also the lawsuit risk that comes from many of these privacy regulations.
It's an interesting point you make, of course, because when we think about, for example, accounting standards, regulations, and so forth, they tend to exact a heavier toll on smaller businesses. And so I would imagine that privacy regulations surrounding AI would have the same impact on smaller businesses. How do we democratize AI, not only for consumers, but also for small and large businesses alike, with a regulatory framework that supports, sort of this full scale of applications and uses?
Yeah, and that's what we're working on now. And I have to say, I really applaud the U.S. government, both Majority Leader Schumer in the Senate and also the White House and the other agencies. They're approaching this very thoughtfully. They have a good sense of what they don't know and don't understand about AI. And so they're holding listening and information gathering sessions this fall. There are 9 of them that are going to be undertaken by the Senate, and they have very robust participation from the senators. And I think that this kind of very thoughtful, but also a brisk pace for D.C. approach to AI regulation is a very welcome thing. And I think that we'll see regulations in the U.S. soon. And one of the things that we're reminding all policymakers of, and I think that they understand this, is that, you can't write policies and regulations just for the large companies, the very large players that we're all familiar with, Google and Microsoft, just to name 2. There are smaller, startup companies in this space, and you have to be able to put all the appropriate guardrails in place for consumers while also allowing innovation to flourish. The U.S. leading AI around the world is incredibly important. Right now, we do lead around the world. We're ahead of China, our closest competitor, but only by months, not by years. And it is important that the U.S. leads so that we can help set the standards for safe and responsible AI use all across the world. And so that is the job that the U.S. policymakers have. One thing to keep in mind is just a few months ago, there was a study out of Australia that showed that Chinese researchers lead American researchers in 37 of 44 emerging technologies. That is a definite wake-up call. We need to really think about the kind of immigration policies that we have in place in America that allows us to keep and attract the world's best talent. That's severely lacking, while all of our competitors are definitely putting in place new laws to take advantage of that. And then we also have to look at the kind of focus that we have on computer science and STEM education for children in this country. Only half of our schools offer computer science classes. They can't take classes that aren't even offered to them. So we're huge advocates of those kinds of things, too, in addition to workforce training.
So let's talk about AI's impact on the workforce, because I think workforce training is one component of it, right? What else do you expect policymakers and businesses can do to help prepare for these challenges that workers will face?
Yeah, for the government, just the things that I just mentioned in terms of changes that we can make for immigration policies, but also workforce training and STEM education, that is definitely something that's getting more traction, but still we have a long way to go. Businesses already, the leaders of our companies in America, all of them are preparing for the changes that AI will bring. And so upskilling and reskilling their workforce is very much top of mind. And one thing that people should know is I know that there are a lot of scary stories out there about how AI will replace so many jobs. But studies show that 63% of U.S. jobs will be complemented by AI. Those workers will be able to get freed up from those rote tasks, those things that they view as maybe the drudgery of their job, so that they can focus on more creative thought and priority setting. 30% of U.S. jobs would be untouched. And so, AI is a tool for us to use. It is not the end-all, be-all. And I think that people need to be more familiar with that story.
Linda, please tell us where we can learn more about TechNet and where we can follow you on social media.
Yes, go to technet.org. That's TECHNET.org. And then you can follow me on Twitter at Linda Moore DC. And you will also find the TechNet platform on LinkedIn and also on Threads in addition to Twitter. So I hope everyone will take a look at what we're doing and get involved.
What do you hope people will learn the most about TechNet, or what do you hope to share with the public about TechNet? What message do you hope to diffuse?
Yes, I guess it would be that, the big tech companies in particular have, gone from sort of white hat to maybe gray hat in the last few years in terms of how people have viewed it. There's become a narrative that maybe they have too much power or control, and that especially comes into play when you think of social media. But U.S. technology companies, they really value and need the trust and confidence of consumers. So we're actively working with policymakers to get really important pieces of legislation passed that will put in place privacy regulations and guardrails for how children use the social media, and also now with AI, those important guardrails and protections, while also making sure that we get all the societal and economic benefits of AI. So the technology industry in the U.S. is very much concerned about consumers and the growth of our businesses and wanting the very best for our overall economy and our people. And we're working side by side with policymakers to try to ensure they have all the information that they need to put those kind of policies in place.
And I wonder, how do you educate policymakers in real time, right? Because these technologies are evolving so rapidly that it would be difficult for anyone who doesn't work in the sector day to day to understand the size, speed, scale, scope, implications of the technologies, and to formulate adequate policy responses. How do you help educate them? How do you help keep them abreast of these changes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I work in this business, and it's hard for me too, and that's one of the things I love about it. I love that I will never master this job. It is always changing, growing, evolving. We have a federal team in Washington, D.C., who is interacting with federal policymakers all the time. And then we also have a 50-state operation. We have 7 executive directors scattered across the country, led by a vice president, and we are there with them in day-to-day interactions, in email exchanges. We're engaging with them all the time to answer any and all of their questions and to talk to them about the kinds of bills that they're thinking of proposing and moving forward, and making sure that we can work with them to understand what is the desired effect that you're trying to have with this legislation and what could be some of the unintended consequences, how best to craft this bill and this regulation. We have some, tech champions, so to speak, who are very well versed, at least more than most, at the federal level and at the state level. And then you have some policymakers who, understandably, are working on other issues and aren't as up to speed. And we work with all of those, just to make sure that they understand how the technology works and how best to put forward regulations that can actually be carried out by the technology. So it's literally a day-to-day, ongoing conversation all the time.
Who do you think is what country or countries or areas do you think are sort of the best-in-class example of how technology and companies or governing bodies can work together?
Well, that's a good question. There's been a lot written about, the EU moving forward with regulations and the U.S. lagging. But we've also seen a lot of negative impact of those regulations that have been put into place, especially GDPR, the data protection measure that was put in place in the EU, it had the effect that I spoke about earlier in that it gave greater market share to the largest technology companies and really drove a lot of the smaller and medium-sized companies out of the marketplace because they couldn't meet the compliance burden financially, resource-wise, and also open to lawsuits. That's the exact opposite effect that policymakers want to have. I understand that. I think they're understanding now the negative consequences of what they put in place and are trying to find ways to mitigate that. So with the U.S., we have moved more slowly on privacy. I think we're getting more and more traction on that now that we've seen so many states develop their own privacy laws in the absence of a federal privacy law. And then here in the U.S., what's really important about the regulations that are being developed around AI is that the White House very wisely is working with countries all across the world in developing a coherent, cohesive approach to AI so that they're very much out front taking the lead and building those relationships across the world so that we can all work together to develop the very best practices for AI. And I think that's the very smart way to go. What we don't need, and what we've seen a little bit in the past couple of years, is sort of like an arms race, so to speak, between the U.S. and the EU and maybe some other countries on who's going to regulate first. And you know, we want the regulation, but we also want it to be smart and thoughtful and well done. And so I think that, you know, that latter goal is the most important thing rather than speed. But I feel like we're in a good place right now and that we'll have AI regulation soon and hopefully around the world that will make sure that China, Russia, and other countries that are competing against us and might not share our same values in how AI should be responsibly used will then be pressured to adhere to a good, responsible AI framework.
Linda, it's been such a pleasure to have you join us. Thank you again.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Janet.